Hello, I'm Cara Dahl Russell, and today I'll be talking with you about the life of composer Antonin Dvorak, and in particular, his cello concerto. When I first gave this pre-concert lecture live in 2017 for the Mid-Atlantic Symphony Orchestra, there were two major works on the program, both of which took the composers by surprise because they incorporated things the composers had said they disliked. So my unifying theme in speaking about these was never say never. Consider this quote about the cello. The cello is a fine orchestral instrument, but totally insufficient for a solo concerto. Those were the words of Dvorak, who also said that he liked the middle register, felt the high register was irritating and nasal, and that the bass register was indistinct and mumbling. Ultimately, displaying a charming ability to laugh at himself, Dvorak wrote to a friend, quote, "I myself am probably most surprised by my decision to write a cello concerto, despite my long-held reservations," unquote. You have to love someone who can laugh at themselves. Antonin Dvorak was born in Multhaus, Bohemia, near Prague, on September 8, 1841, and died in Prague on May 1, 1904. There is a saying in Bohemia that when a child is born, the parents would place a silver spoon near one hand and a violin near the other. Whichever one the child reached for would be his future, a wealthy tradesman or an indigent musician. Dvorak's father probably just put the spoon in little Antonin's hand and wrapped the tiny fingers around it because he had no intention of his son becoming a musician. Father Dvorak was an innkeeper and butcher, with businesses that were growing during Antonin's growth. With multiple locations, he wanted and needed a son to share the running of the business. But it must be remembered that at this time, Bohemia was still considered the music school of Europe. Music was an integral part of the culture, and even Dvorak's father played violin, zither, sang, and played in the village band. As a child, Antonin Dvorak played violin to entertain his father's customers, performed at village fairs, and sang in the church choir. He was preoccupied with music and avidly listened to the older musicians in town and absorbed the folk music of his region that became so much a part of his later work. At 14, Antonin was sent to live with his uncle to learn German, a necessary language for an innkeeper, but this larger town was also the place where a music teacher recognized his aptitude and gave him formal lessons in viola, piano, and organ. The same teacher made great efforts to raise funds for Dvorak to be able to study in Prague, and to convince Antonin's father to let him be sent to study there. But the father insisted that music is a hobby, not a profession, the same thing that many parents still say today. At 16, Dvorak was back with his father, helping to run the family business, but music continued as part of his life, and a year later Dvorak's uncle agreed to put up the money for Antonin to study in Prague. He was regarded as an industrious student, studying music theory, organ, memorizing scores, playing in the orchestra, and beginning to compose. This was the 1860s, when much of the German world was in political upheaval. Also, industrialization was widening the chasm between rich and poor. More importantly, it was creating a new wealthy working class and the failure of the nobility and leisure classes. A year into school, Dvorak's family business took a downturn for both father and uncle, and Antonin had to make the decision to come home for good or to be cut off and to make his own way. The rest is history. He did indeed become an itinerant musician, playing with a variety of bands for tips, giving concerts, and gigging in orchestras. He put his funds towards continuing his music studies. These years and the years after graduation he referred to as, quote, hard study, occasional composing, much revision, a great deal of time thinking, and very little eating, unquote. After graduation, he said, I studied with God, with the birds, and the trees, and myself. He studied the music of Beethoven, and also was greatly influenced by the music of Bedřich Šmetna, who had premiered The Bartered Bride. This directed his thinking towards Bohemian national music. This was a trend that was ripe all over Europe, with composers rediscovering a national sound, an idea that had skipped a generation. In the Baroque era, while there was a common accepted form for music suites, it was also generally accepted that each country had its own sound and style of ornamentation. This is why Bach could write English suites and French suites, and Couperin could compose Italian suites, and a full set of suites in each national style. Then after 1750, in the classical era as typified by Mozart's life, travel became easier, and with it came a blending of sounds into a more unified classical era sound. Musicians traveled around, heard various styles, and influenced each other. This created a very homogeneous sound throughout Europe, and also helped solidify musical form and structure. It was during this time that the typical sonata form was codified as fast, slow, fast, and that symphonies, whether stormy or happy, increasingly took on an accepted form with a grand opening and a positive ending. It's worth noting that this form still influences musicals and recitals today in being the normal, quote, dramatic flow, unquote, of a performance. So when the composer Beethoven began to explore folk music, it was a break from music as being something formal and codified, and it opened the floodgates for composers of the Romantic era that followed him, of which Dvorak was one. The accepted symphonic structure began to grow and to be tinkered with. Wagner and Mahler took symphonies to a new seat cushion testing length. Composers began to re-explore folk music as a springboard for a national sound. Borodin, Mussorgsky, Smetana, Dvořák, Schubert, Schumann, Grieg, Sibelius, and later Fauré and Granger, these are the names we immediately recognize who became committed to creating a sound that reflected a sound of their homeland. The concurrent popularity of the song There Is No Place Like Home at this time is a microcosm of this personal nationalism and pride of place. So Dvorak was very much in tune with his time musically, and this happenstance is invariably part of what helps solidify a career. Throughout all musical ages, we can see three patterns for composers. 1. The beginning of a movement. Composers who are groundbreaking for their day. Their work is often not popular during their day. If they are lucky, it is recognized before their death, when they are often lionized as being the impetus for a new sound. These composers also become the big names whose work is studied for generations. 2. The middle of the movement. These composers have a network of other composers who agree with and support their work. Their sound is generally understood by the public and meets with great popular success. Their popularity and financial success often leads to influential teaching posts and the perpetuation of their musical ideas and an ease of getting their works performed. Their works become symphonic workhorses that are regularly heard in rotation with the works of the big names. 3. End of a movement. While these composers create music that is the zenith and the crystallization of a particular sound, they come at the end of an era, and a new generation is simultaneously reacting against that established sound. Their work is usually very popular with the public and often very beautiful, and they can be very big names in their day. But simultaneously, their work is also usually criticized for being derivative, old school, or dusty, or chasing after what has already been done. While many of these composers finally accomplish a sound that the first two groups have been working toward, the next group of young composers are contemporaries who are focused on developing a new sound. This third group of composers, through no fault or lack of talent of their own, have just been born at the wrong time. Despite their fame, their names usually diminish quickly, and it is only when their work is later rediscovered is it appreciated for being a refined jewel of a particular sound world. So Beethoven was from Group 1, the one who formed the new sound, broke rules, and created a ruckus. And lucky Dvorak was part of the second group, born at the right time to really see the full appreciation and fruits of his work. While his very early works were an imitation of the more dominant German school, Dvorak was very quick to shake off the ideas and influence of Wagner and to focus on his own national sound. And once he did that, he had immediate and resounding success after success. He won prizes, commissions, and the admiration and friendship of powerful established contemporaries like Hans von Bülow, Franz Liszt, and especially Brahms. This led to celebrity status where he toured to conduct his music in London in 1884 at the age of 43, to the roaring applause of audiences as large as 12,000. This success enabled him to buy an estate in the forests of his homeland, which became an essential retreat for him and enabled him to remain very true to his roots. When one contemporary complained that Dvorak could not discuss anything but music, a friend of his replied, "Did you try talking to him about pigs?" A year after his London success, he was offered a position in America. Jeanette M. Thurber was the wife of a New York wholesale grocer. She exhausted her husband's millions trying to establish an English-language opera company that folded, and also a national conservatory of music that flourished for a while, long enough to entice Dvorak to settle temporarily in the New World. The decision to leave home was very difficult for Dvorak, but Mrs. Thurber's persistence won out, and the composer agreed to serve as director of her school for $15,000 a year, about $150,000 today. He agreed to the conditions of a 2-year contract that included 3 hours daily teaching, preparation of student concerts, and conducting concerts of his own in various American towns. It was Mrs. Thurber's specific intention that Dvorak provide a figurehead for her conservatory and found an American school of composition. And this first extended stay in the United States produced his New World Symphony. So I think we can thank Mrs. Thurber and recognize that she did her bit for the history of music in America. In 1892, Dvorak was as famous as any composer alive. Taking on an administrative title and a heavy teaching schedule was probably an unfortunate waste of his time and talents, but the music Dvorak wrote in this country includes some of his best: the New World Symphony, a string quartet and a string quintet, both titled American, and this cello concerto. And this is where we came in, with Dvorak's feeling that the cello simply was not up to being a solo instrument with the orchestra. Aside from his other feelings, he had a major reservation about being able to balance the basically mellow voice of a cello with the huge sound of a full Romantic-era orchestra. But, as often happens in life, he was provided with an inspiration. When Dvorak arrived to head the conservatory in 1892, Victor Herbert was the head of the cello department. Herbert had come to the United States from Vienna only 6 years before and was highly regarded as a cellist, conductor, and composer, though he hadn't yet written the first of the 40 operettas that would make him enormously popular. Naughty Marietta, The Red Mill, and Babes in Toyland are some of his titles. The cellist Hans Wieland, a close friend of Dvorak, had been pestering him for years to write a cello concerto. In 1894, Victor Herbert premiered his own cello concerto, and it was a revelation for Dvorak. Herbert's knowledge of the cello must have illuminated ways to surmount the compositional problems that Dvorak had struggled with. Clearly, it inspired him. Herbert's middle movement was in B minor, which may have inspired Dvorak to write his concerto in the same key, and Dvorak's concerto was completed within a year. A month after completing it, however, he returned home and found that his sister-in-law, with whom he had once been in love, had died of a serious illness. This led him to substitute 60 bars of new music, replacing 4 measures just before the end of the piece. After the last bar, he wrote in the manuscript, quote, "I finished the concerto in New York, but when I returned home to Bohemia, I changed the end completely as it stands here now, the 11th of June, 1895, unquote. Specifically, the slow, wistful section before the triumphant ending quotes his song titled Leave Me Alone, his Opus 82 B-157 No. 1, which had been a favorite of his sister-in-law. The finale, he wrote, should close gradually with a diminuendo, quote, like a breath. Then there is a crescendo, and the last measures are taken up by the orchestra, ending stormily. That was my idea, and from it I cannot recede. End quote. On the 7th of March, 1897, Brahms heard Hugo Becker's performance of the piece in a concert of the Vienna Philharmonic, and he said to his friend Gansbacher before the concert, quote, "Today you will hear a real piece, a male piece," unquote. Brahms is reported as saying, quote, "If I had known that it was possible to compose such a concerto for the cello, I would have tried it myself," unquote. Among all cello concertos, Dvorak's has been called supreme and the greatest. You will want to particularly listen for his own solution to the problem of the balance between the orchestra and the solo voice of the cello. One of the ways of doing this is to delay the entrance of the cello, as if it were a diva making a dramatic stage entrance. And then later he pairs the cello with sections of the orchestra at a time, which creates tremendous variety within the work. The Cello Concerto of Antonin Dvorak. Enjoy.